It's me, Nick Dagan Best, astrologer and live streamer, not necessarily equally both. Hope you're all doing well today. It's a special day for me. It's my 55th birthday. And yeah, we had a great stream yesterday with Patrick. And as usual, I'm doing my Monday morning follow up. Well, I guess for some of you, this is Monday afternoon, maybe even Monday evening. Hell, if you live in Japan, if you're watching this from Japan or anywhere in Southeast Asia, then I guess it's Tuesday or something. Anyway, whatever hour of the day it is for you, welcome. Yeah, I was just yesterday we did. Oh, thank you, Stephanie. Yesterday, Patrick and I were. No, Sam's not with me again today. He's here next week. So yeah, it's only half the fun, I'm afraid. Haneen, if I'll try to make it worth your while if you stick around. Hi, Apurba. Thank you. Yeah, yesterday Patrick and I were doing our blind ephemeris thing, and I thought I might follow up and just see if those of you who watched yesterday's stream have any questions about what we did yesterday, what you might have learned, sort of pick it up from there, because I think it was yeah, one of the better streams we've done, and a really good use of this format. Thank you for all the birthday wishes. I guess they're they're all coming in. Thank you. The first water of my 8th house perfection year. All right. So yeah, for my birthday. Let's see what we can do here. Oh yeah, there was one thing Patrick was talking about yesterday. Mars-Jupiter conjunctions. Let's save this selection. Save it for future use. So I'm starting in the year 1750. I'm looking for the next 275 years. Just by it's set for Berlin, but it doesn't really matter what part of the world this is set for. So I'm just looking for conjunctions, first harmonic aspects, that is, between Mars and Jupiter over a period of 275 years. So I do the search. And we can look at this list chronologically, but we can also look at it by sign, by degree rather, not even just sign, but by degree. And what Patrick was saying, that there's a Mars return every, I think he said 190 years. And I wanted to sort of see how close that is. But to my mind, it looks like that I mean, we're not getting any exact to the degree conjunctions, or at least not many. I guess here's one between 1942 and 2024. So that's an 82-year window for these two that are at 16 degrees of Gemini. But for the large part, even over a period of 275 years, we're not getting that many repeats. The retrogrades are interesting. But I don't, yeah. But there's no sort of fathomable pattern to those. Anyway, just scrolling down this list. I guess the one thing I can point out about this is Um, the ones where Mars is retrograde, there's only 3 of them in the past 275 years. There's 4 times when Jupiter's retrograde, but only 3 when Mars is. And you'll notice the Mars retrogrades, 2 of them are in Leo and 1 is in Virgo. And as you've probably heard me discuss, um, a number of times on this stream or elsewhere, Mars retrogrades in Leo and Virgo are a lot more common than they are in, say, their opposite counterparts, Aquarius and Pisces, which are very rare. Mars retrogrades in Leo and Virgo reoccur every 15 to 17 years, whereas the retrogrades of Mars in Aquarius and Pisces can take up to 47 years to reoccur, anywhere between, usually, yeah, it can be 32 to 47, but usually about 47. So consequentially, Mars spends a lot more time in Leo and Virgo than it does in Aquarius and Pisces, just by law of averages. And so the fact that the only 3 instances in the last 275 years that Mars and Jupiter have been conjunct while Mars is retrograde, the fact that it's in these signs isn't surprising in that in its own right. You can even, when you scroll through the list, you can see that Mars spends a lot more time in Leo and Virgo than it does in the other signs. The further out you go, although, there's still a number of them in Aquarius and Pisces. Anyway, that's the first thing that occurred to me that I wanted to sort of just look through. Apurba, yes, there was a Mars retrograde in Aquarius in 2018, and sorry, I'm seeing some of the earlier comments. More birthday wishes. Thank you, thank you. And Apurba was asking me if I have any goals for this year. Well, stay alive. Be happy. Take it day by day. Basically, the same thing as always. The Mars retrograde in Aquarius in 2018. Yes. I can imagine that one was rough certainly for some people. It was the first Mars retrograde in 18 since first Mars retrograde in Aquarius since 1971, 47 years earlier. The thing I found interesting about that, I don't know if I've ever covered this on this stream, but this is a good sort of jump off point. I'm going to open a slideshow here. Moment to open, and then I'll share the screen with you. This is just like a survey of times when Mars was retrograde in Aquarius in Russian history, or close to it anyway. So first off, we have this is one of the last battles against Napoleon. Basically, they defeat. It's a combined force of Russian and Austrian and I think British forces fighting Napoleon in Saxony and Leipzig. They call it the Battle of Nations. And this is just after Mars is stationing direct in Aquarius in the year 1813. And then the next one is also in 1813. This is when Russia basically, they fought a war with Persia, and they claimed territory that gives them parts of what is today Georgia and Azerbaijan. So they're sort of expanding their territory and taking away from the Persian Empire, this area in the Caucasus. You can see the map here. There's the 1801 border and then the 1813 border. And then the years later, this is a Mars retrograde in just after there was a Mars retrograde in Sagittarius, just before Mars goes retrograde, I think in Capricorn. The opposition will be in Sagittarius. This was a Russia-Japan treaty that gave Russia the Kuril Islands. So you can see these are all these periods. I mean, the first one, the Battle of Nations, was Russia just sort of fighting back France's, Napoleon's expansive empire building. But everything since, this is Russia sort of signing treaties and expanding their territory gradually. It goes further and further. If it's not expanding their territory, it's these important other sort of like military conventions. When Mars was just about to go retrograde in Aquarius in 1892, Russia and France signed a military convention, and this is the one that sort of set the stage for their alliance in the First World War. I mean, Britain would later join them. And then in 1907, when Mars was just coming out of its retrograde in Capricorn, this is when Russia and Great Britain signed their treaty that made them put them in an alliance. In this instance, with regard to carving up Persia, but it also sort of brings them together when the First World War will come apart. So even though this is 15 years after Russia signed the treaty with France, but in both these instances, when Mars was retrograde in one of these really rare signs, Capricorn or Aquarius, that's exactly when these treaties get signed. So it's just such an interesting part of Russian foreign relations. This is a famous one. I'm sure everyone has heard of this. This is the famous Ribbentrop-Malenkov Pact, the Soviet Nazi non-aggression pact in 1939. This is what, just as Mars, the very day Mars is signed as stationing direct in Capricorn, this Mars retrograde had gone from early Aquarius into Capricorn. But the very day that Mars is stationing direct is the day that this treaty is signed that basically leads to Germany and the Soviet Union invading Poland and carving it up, dividing it in half. Of course, 2 years later, they'll go to war with each other. But this is when they're still agreeing to just sort of split Poland between them. Now, this is years later. It's 1971. It's the Cold War. But in 1971, just as Mars has stationed direct in Aquarius, like 7 days after it's stationed direct in Aquarius in 1971, Brandt, what was his name? Willy Brandt? Yeah, Willy Brandt, who was the West German chancellor. He went to Crimea to meet with Leonid Brezhnev, and this is sort of the beginning of détente really taking hold. Up until this point, West Germany and Russia didn't really, and Soviet Union didn't really have relations to speak of. And then 1986, Mars just coming out of its retrograde in Capricorn. It's just entered early Aquarius. And this was the famous Reykjavik summit between Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, where the Cold War is starting to thaw, where they reach some sort of tentative agreements that'll lead to some progress later on. And okay, so that's funny, I don't have 2018 there, but I thought somewhere I did have a slide of 2018. I have too many slides, folks. I don't even know where I keep them all. Okay, more birthday messages coming in. Let's see here. What else do we have? Bear with me. Let's see. I was sure I made a. There we are. Okay, it's in another slideshow. Um, there it is. Okay. I had it in a different slideshow. So just to complete that thought, I showed you all those other Mars retrogrades in Aquarius, which only occur every 47 years, 32 to 47 years. But as it happens, whenever Russia and or the Soviet Union or whoever's in charge of Russia at the time, whenever they are making important alliances, some of the most important ones, either alliances or treaties where they expanded their territory, is a really important sort of diplomatic achievements in Russian history. They're always very, very close to these really rare Mars retrogrades in either Aquarius or Capricorn. And yeah, I just wanted to show you this last slide to sort of complete that thought, because it's really something that's worth paying attention to. Um, when when we got to 2018, I was already well aware of the pattern, so I wasn't surprised that that was when Trump and Putin met up with the soccer ball and all that stuff. Uh, but yeah, very interesting. Okay. Hi, trees matter. Um, um, Chelsea is asking, can I explain the qualities of the rising and setting phases other than speed if I have time? Um, the qualities of the rising and setting phases other than speed. That hmm. I mean, that's almost all I have been doing, working on for most of these live streams, not just now when I was talking about Mars, but I talk about Venus in most of my live streams, and that's kind of what we're working towards. I guess I think some people sometimes want me to stray from that and and do other talk about other things, but maybe some people just want me to stick with Venus and talk about Venus. Um, which most of the time I do, not just when Venus is retrograde. So I don't know. I mean, that's kind of that is what I do most of the time here on the stream. So I don't know. I tried talking about Mars, but there you go. Some people just want me to talk about Venus, I guess. Um, okay. I mean, I don't really know, you know, I mean, I have notions of that. This is still a really hard thing to. Um, Sorry, excuse me a minute. Let me see what I can do here. More nice birthday wishes. Thank you, everyone. Um, so what I mean, I think in some ways, so far my research in looking at the relative difference between rising and setting phases with the Venus cycle is I've maybe sort of taken more away than I've replaced. Um, One of the sort of the standard claims you still hear people sort of parrot it all the time is this idea that the morning star Venus is more sort of warlike than the evening star Venus, or is it the other way around? See, now I sometimes even confuse the two because I really haven't found the one to be more warlike than the other. Um, I'm interested in exploring these and uncovering them, but I don't know that I have anything to offer in terms of like a concrete distinction between the two. Here, I'll show you. We can just, we can look at some together. That's all I can really offer. Is, if we look through these, maybe I'll go all the way to the back here. So morning star, these are rising sea interval people. So you'll get some red fours, some white threes, and some blue twos here, but they're all morning star or at least rising under the beams. Going backward through time, Duke of Cambridge, Castro Surovikin. This is the Russian commander who's disappeared recently. He's probably dead by now or rotting away in some prison. David Cameron, who was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom about a decade or so ago. Janet Jackson, one of three Jacksons who were rising seas. This is a journalist, a Russian journalist, Anna Politkovskaya, who was assassinated. She was very critical of the Putin regime during the Chechen War, the Second Chechen War. Michael Jackson, just like Janet Jackson, the rising sea. Madonna, Prince, Andy Gibb, Tim Kaine, Senator Kaine, who was also at one point governor of Virginia. Jim Mattis, you guys might remember him as one of Trump's Secretary of Defense. Lance Ito, who was the judge during the O.J. Simpson trial. This is another another Russian who was assassinated, probably by someone in the Putin regime or connected to it. Sergei Yushchenkov, who was killed in 2003. Rebbe Jackson, older sister to Michael and Janet Jackson, so three rising seas in the Jackson family. William Barr, as some of you might remember, was Trump's attorney general. So we've seen two people from Trump's cabinet who are rising seas. And Trump, of course, is a setting sea. More musicians. Stevie Wonder is a rising sea. Agneta Falskog from ABBA. Alito, Justice Alito. Sergei Lavrov, who's the Soviet foreign minister. Paul McCartney, a rather obscure musician who had some renown back in the 60s. Thabo Mbeki, who was the second president of South Africa, of post-apartheid South Africa. John Ashcroft, this was George W. Bush's attorney general, so we've seen a few attorney generals here. Jacob Zuma, the fourth president of South Africa. So there's a lot of presidents of South Africa. There's at least one more coming up, a rather notorious one coming up. Anita Pallenberg, who was she was a model and actress. She's in the movie Barbarella, and she was a girlfriend first to Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, and then she left him for Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones. The great Aretha Franklin. So yeah, there've been a lot of musicians here. You've seen Aretha Franklin is a red 4 as opposed to a white 3. So a lot of those other musicians you saw, Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, Prince, Paul McCartney, they're all white 3 rising seas, but Aretha Franklin is a rising sea as well. John Cale, another great musician, a member of the Velvet Underground, and also a very notable record producer as well as a solo artist in his own right. Tammy Faye Messner, she used to be Tammy Faye Baker back in the 80s. You would remember her from the PTL Club and her husband's sex scandal. Lou Reed, another member of the Velvet Underground, another musician, rising sea guy. Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, I was just talking about his girlfriend a few minutes ago. He was a rising sea, red 4 rising sea. Joe Lieberman, U.S. Senator and second Attorney General of Connecticut. Christine Keeler. She was part of a big scandal in Britain, a political scandal, because she was involved with a British politician and a Soviet spy at the same time, and it brought down a British government in 1963. And speaking of revolutionaries, Huey Newton, co-founder of the Black Panthers. Another great musician, Carole King, the songwriter and singer extraordinaire. Oh, yeah, this guy, this charming fellow, um, Jeb Magruder, who was he was one of the people on Nixon's staff who wound up getting convicted for the cover up, the Watergate cover up. Ulrike Meinhof, who was this is another revolutionary. She was a West German journalist who was writing about the Bader Meinhof Red Army group, and then she wound up joining them. So she went from being a journalist to actually joining the revolutionary group. Yeah, it's a long, very interesting story. She wound up taking her own life in prison. It's definitely a tragic story, but it gives you a sense of the politics of the day. Brian Epstein, who was the manager of the Beatles and really important in engineering their path to success. He died tragically very young. Bob Heppel, this is someone else from South African history. He was one of the defendants in the Rivonia trial, the same trial that sent Nelson Mandela to prison. And we'll be talking about Mandela himself in a few minutes. Robert Stigwood, so kind of like Brian Epstein, Robert Stigwood was an important sort of music manager in the 60s, and he represented Cream and the Bee Gees. And so like Saturday Night Fever was a big achievement of his. This is Roman Herzog. He was a president of West Germany quite a while back when there was such a thing as West Germany. Senator Orrin Hatch, he was a U.S. senator. I don't think he's still in the Senate, is he? I gotta update him. I'm not even sure if he's still alive. Yuri Gagarin, the first human being in space. He was later killed in a plane crash. He's a Soviet cosmonaut. Another Red 4. You'll see there's a lot of Russian Red 4s, a lot of notable Russian Red 4s. Ralph Nader, who was an activist for consumer and environmental protection. And of course, he was one of the candidates in the 2000 presidential election. H.R. Haldeman, he was a White House chief of staff to Richard Nixon. He's another one of the men who went to jail for the Watergate cover-up. Chuck Berry, another great musician. So you see, we see a lot of rising Cs. Now he's a blue 2 rather than a rising than a white 3. He's a blue 2, but he is a rising C. And lo and behold, we get Chuck Berry as a rising C, and then before him, John Coltrane is a rising C. Talk about great musicians. In my opinion, this is it right here, the greatest. So he's another rising C, a blue 2 rising C. The poet Allen Ginsberg, Marilyn Monroe, famous actress and sex icon. And Miles Davis, yet another great rising C. This is a white 3 musician, but you can see there's a lot of really notable musicians in this group. Virgilio Gonzalez, yet someone else related to the Watergate break-in. He was also involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion. He was a Cuban sort of anti-Castro mercenary. The late Queen Elizabeth II, who was Queen of England right up until last September when she died. Yet someone else related to the Watergate affair. As you folks can tell, I'm a big Richard Nixon student of Richard Nixon astrology. So I like to know like all the different, there's so many different, this is the kind of thing I really love for research projects, is when there's a lot of different people with different birthdays that I can sort of compare and group and see how they all sort of fit into the big narrative. That's something I find really interesting to do. So this is Alexander Butterfield. He was the guy, he worked in the White House and he was one of the only people who knew about the taping system. Remember when the Watergate break-in happened, that was like a whole year before the world learned that Richard Nixon had, these secret recordings of his conversations in the Oval Office. And Alexander Butterfield is the guy who had to sort of reveal to the Congress committee, the Watergate committee, that this taping system existed. So he's a really, in some ways obscure, but a really pivotal, important figure in history, in American history, insofar as like, yeah, I mean, Watergate would have been a very different thing if the world never learned about the tapes. But definitely Nixon wouldn't have wound up resigning. Most importantly. This is Ian Paisley. He was an Irish Ulster politician, the second first minister of Northern Ireland. So we're talking about an Irish Protestant, and so if you know about the Irish, the troubles in Northern Ireland and the division between the Protestants and Catholics. This is someone from the Protestant faction. Ulster, yeah, meaning they're aligned to the United Kingdom as opposed to being aligned to the Republic. This is Ralph Abernethy, who was Martin Luther King's sort of, his good friend, and I was going to say second in command, but I don't know if that's like technically accurate or not. But he was his very frequent companion through the bulk of King's life as a spokesman and activist, and he was there when King was killed in '68. This is Kim Jae-gyu. He was the president of South Korea, and he was executed, assassinated. Yeah. This is Stalin's daughter, Svetlana Alliluyeva. She defected to the U.S. in 1967. She's got a really, really interesting life story. There's a great book written by Rosemary. I'll have to look her name up if any of you are interested. But Stalin's Daughter is the name of the book, by Rosemary something. And really, really great book, really interesting story. So she's a rising sea, a red 4 rising sea. Stalin had 3 kids, 2 of whom were red interval children. Oh, this is Neil Cassidy. I showed you Allen Ginsberg a little while ago, who's a poet. This is Neil Cassidy, who was part of the same sort of beat entourage of. He was a friend of Jack Kerouac's and Allen Ginsberg, and he sort of turns up as a figure in a lot of beat literature. He's kind of a mythological figure at this point. He was also one of the Merry Pranksters. He drove if you know about Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, Neil Cassidy was the guy who actually drove the famous psychedelic bus with, I think it was the bus that said it went nowhere, on the front, where buses could sort of have their destination indicated. Anyway, yeah, kind of a figure out of literary mythology, hippie psychedelic mythology. Someone decidedly non-psychedelic. This is possibly the most unpsychedelic individual who ever lived. This is Spiro Agnew. He was the vice president with Richard Nixon, and before the whole Watergate thing could take Nixon down, Agnew had to resign after, not being convicted, but being on trial for tax evasion charges. And I guess he pleaded no contest. I guess that's a conviction. All right. Tell me if you know more about the law than I do. I mean, pleading no contest to me is almost like pleading guilty. That's how I understand it. If I've misunderstood something, or if the distinctions are lost on me, so be it. Another attorney general. This is Griffin Bell. I believe he was attorney general to Jimmy Carter, if I remember correctly. So we've seen a few attorney generals here, like 3 so far, if I'm not mistaken. And going back to Watergate, a lot of Watergate people. Mind you, I just have a good list of Watergate figures. This is E. Howard Hunt, who was a CIA officer. He was involved. He was like sort of the head of the burglary team that was that had broken into the Watergate Hotel. He sort of set that whole thing up. He and G. Gordon Liddy were the two sort of masterminds behind it. He wasn't with the burglary team, but he was, convicted alongside the others. And yeah, and he's someone who turns up in a lot of this sort of ugly CIA stuff. He was definitely at the Bay of Pigs, and I think yeah, you see him all over the place if you read about various CIA shenanigans. This is Rosemary Kennedy. Um, she's the oldest daughter of Joe and Rose Kennedy. So she's younger than John F. Kennedy, but older than Bobby Kennedy. And she's the daughter who was given a lobotomy, which the family came to really regret. Basically ruined her. But yeah, she because she was I mean, she had some kind of, I don't know if it's considered a birth defect or something, but she wasn't mentally sort of, up to the rest of her siblings, and they were trying to fix a problem and or what they perceived to be a problem, and made the whole situation a lot worse. So she's sort of this tragic figure that you hear about in the Kennedy family. And if you think like her sister Eunice started the Special Olympics for um, people who are disabled, and that's in part inspired by what happened to her older sister Rosemary. Whoops. This is Alexander Shelepin. He's another sort of minor Soviet politician. Well, he was high up at the time, but he's kind of an obscure figure that I just keep track of my Soviets here. Well, this is Nelson Mandela. We've seen a lot of South Africans going through this list. Two other South African presidents, Mbeki and Zuma. And yes, Nelson Mandela, the first president of the new Republic of South Africa that was founded in 1994. He is also a rising sea phase. This is a recent addition to the collection. This is Richard Feynman, a famous theoretical physicist, a Nobel Prize laureate. He's a very minor character in the Oppenheimer movie. He's the guy sitting in the car when at the Trinity test. Feynman was part of the Manhattan Project, and when they tested the bomb at Trinity in Los Alamos in July of 1945. Rather than put on protective goggles, he sat in a car and watched the explosion from behind the windshield of the car. This is Betty Ford, former First Lady, wife of President Gerald Ford, and of course very famous for being a recovered alcoholic who in turn set up a recovery center for alcoholics and drug addicts, the famous Betty Ford Clinic. This is Howard Cosell, who is Red 4 Rising Sea, known very well for his association with another Red 4 named Muhammad Ali. They made quite the media pair back in the 70s. Cosell was a television sports broadcaster, but also something of an intellectual and social critic. And famous for saying he's just telling it like it is. Quite a special guy. Elliot Roosevelt, he's one of the sons of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and he was also at one point, the mayor of Miami Beach. And yet another important South African figure. This is Govan Mbeki. He's the father of Thabo Mbeki, who was the second president of South Africa. And Govan Mbeki was another one of the Rivonia trial defendants. I've shown you a few, including Nelson Mandela was also one of the defendants in the Rivonia trial of 1964, where they were all sentenced to life in prison for their anti-apartheid activism, and all eventually released from prison, as Mandela was in 1990. This is Abe Fortas. He was an associate justice of the U.S. Supreme Court for a little while. He was assigned to the court by Johnson, but then he had to resign because there was some kind of ethical issue. Well, lo and behold, he was associated with Lyndon Johnson most of his adult life. So of course there were some ethical issues. Anyway, he was a Supreme Court justice for, I don't know, 2 years, a year, something like that. This is Robert B. Anderson. He was, another one of these sort of U.S. cabinet ministers. He was Secretary of the Treasury, I think, for Eisenhower, if I remember correctly, and also at one point U.S. Secretary of the Navy. I think he served under a number of presidents, but I'm pretty sure he was Eisenhower's Treasury Secretary. This is Thomas Dewey, who twice ran for president. Once against Franklin Roosevelt, and once against Harry S. Truman, rather. Did I say F. Truman? My apologies to the Truman family. He ran against first Roosevelt in 44 and then Truman in 48. And it was when he ran against Truman in 48, there's that famous headline in the Chicago Tribune. They were sure Dewey was going to win. And they actually printed it on, the headline that Thomas Dewey won the election, even though it was actually Truman who wound up winning the election in the end. There's a famous photo of Truman holding up the newspaper headline, falsely announcing that Dewey had won the election. Playwright, author, John Steinbeck. Is he a playwright? No, I think he's just an author. Maybe I'm getting confused. But yeah, he is an author, the famous Grapes of Wrath, Nobel Prize for Literature laureate. Another great artist, the landscape photographer and environmentalist, Ansel Adams. Okay, well, here we go. As usual, I wind up having some Nazis somewhere in my files. So this is Fritz Sauckel, who was the German Nazi general plenipotentiary for labor deployment. So you just know that involves, slaves and concentration camps and what have you. And he was executed in the Nuremberg trials in 1946. This was the second president of West Germany, Heinrich Lübke. Aldous Huxley, the famous author, who was known for, amongst other things, experimenting with psychedelic drugs. And on November 22nd, 1963, the same day that John F. Kennedy died, and also the same day C.S. Lewis died, on that day, Huxley, I believe, was dying of cancer. And he dosed himself with LSD as he was leaving the planet, as it were. So that's a pretty interesting way to go. Gavrilo Princip, the Serbian nationalist, and the guy who shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So I have gone through the White Three before, and some of you will recognize some of these people from the White Three, but I'm showing you the Rising Sea, and I'm showing you how some of these White Three, all of the White Three people that I've shown you also fit into this larger phase group of Rising Seas, which includes some red fours and some blue twos. Sort of the second half of the red fours and the first half of the blue twos. Another cabinet secretary, the U.S. Secretary of War, Kenneth Claiborne Royal. He served under Roosevelt and Truman. Another Supreme Court justice. This was Justice Rutledge, who supported FDR's court packing plan. Another royal, I showed you Prince William earlier. This is Prince Edward, the Duke of Windsor. He was King Edward VIII, and then he abdicated to marry his American divorcee girlfriend, Wallis Simpson. Rudolf Hess, I promised you Nazis, I'm delivering Nazis. Rudolf Hess is the guy who got all these astrologers in trouble in Nazi Germany because he tried to he flew a plane to Scotland to try and broker peace with Winston Churchill, wound up being taken prisoner. At the end of the war, he went through the Nuremberg trials with all the other defendants, but he was sentenced to life in prison and eventually took his own life in prison in 1987. Khrushchev, the general secretary of the Soviet Union, famous for his period following Stalin in the 50s and 60s before he was eventually overthrown in 1964. He was in charge during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think this is probably his most important claim to fame. Sergo Ordzhonikidze, he's a Georgian Bolshevik. He was a close friend of Stalin's, but Stalin might have, I think Stalin might have had a hand in his death, even though he's not technically assassinated, or executed. But I think, if I remember correctly, Stalin did have some hand in his death. But he was an old friend of Stalin. Not that that would ever save you from Stalin's death machine. Yeah, this is Edward Spears. He's an important British Army guy during the First World War, a liaison between, both World Wars, a liaison between the French and British forces. Francis Biddle, yet another attorney general. He was Franklin Roosevelt's attorney general. So this is what, like the fourth or fifth attorney general I've shown you, who's a rising sea. This is Margaret Wilson. She was an acting First Lady of the USA. I think we've seen her before when I went through the different First Ladies of the USA. She was Woodrow Wilson's daughter, and when her mother died, she served as a sort of temporary acting First Lady of the US. Yeah, this is Mikhail Tereshchenko. He was part of the Russian provisional government before the Bolsheviks took over. So after the Tsar was overthrown, but before the Bolsheviks took over. And he was imprisoned by the Bolsheviks, but he escaped from the Peter and Paul Fortress, which is not an easy thing to do. Another important, this is a Bolshevik. This is Sergei Kirov. He's another one of these important Russian Red 4. There's something about Russian Red 4 you'll see over and over and over again. We'll get to Stalin, not Stalin, Lenin, not long from now. He was a Red 4. But yeah, Kirov is a Red 4, and he is assassinated. And his murder, he was probably more popular than Stalin, and people think Stalin had a hand in his death. And yeah, so with his murder, the Great Terror started of the 1930s when you had all these show trials and all these, I mean, yeah, thousands of people died, because Stalin got really paranoid or something. I mean, it's still kind of a mystery what was going on in his head. But yeah, Kirov's murder just leads to the Great Terror and this whole sort of reactionary movement that the Soviet Union went through in the 30s. This is another U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Hugo Black. He, as a justice, he was known for being very liberal. He's really instrumental in the Brown v. Kansas Board of Education decision of 1954. Really, really instrumental in that. And yet he's also remembered for the fact that he had once been a member of the KKK. His defense was always that, look, he wanted to get into politics in Alabama, and there was no way to be involved in politics in Alabama unless you joined the KKK, and that he had no actual ideological affinity with them, and his membership was brief. You can take that for whatever it's worth, but he's as a justice, he was really instrumental in civil rights. So take your paradoxes, it is what it is. Okay, and Hugo, we went from Hugo Black to Hugo Ball. This always amuses me that they're born just a couple of days apart. They have nothing to do with each other. That's Hugo Black on February 27th and Hugo Ball on February 22nd, 1886. They're both Red 4 White C's, but Hugo Ball is a poet, author, and he's a co-founder of the Dada movement, and the movement that was happening at the Cabaret Voltaire in 1916 in Zurich. Artists from Germany and France and all over, artists from countries that were presently fighting the First World War against each other. All these different artists convened in neutral Zurich and started this artist movement called Dada. It's the precursor to the Surrealist movement. And Hugo Ball is an important figure in this art movement. Bela Kun. this is another after the Bolshevik Revolution. Very temporarily, there was a Hungarian Soviet Republic. It didn't last very long, something like 6 months or a year, in 1919, 1920, something like that. But this is Bela Kun. He was the leader of the Hungarian Soviet Republic, which was overthrown rather severely. By Bela Kun was a Red 4. The guy who overthrew it, Hovarthy, I forget his name, but he was a Red 3, the guy who overthrew him. And eventually Kun was educated in that great purge of that started with Kirov's murder that I was talking about a moment ago. So yeah, just the perils of being a Bolshevik, I guess. And speaking of the perils of being a Bolshevik or having them as an enemy, this is the younger brother of Tsar Nicholas II, Grand Duke Michael of Russia. Um, and he was assassinated even before his brother and his nephew and nieces were murdered in a basement. About a month before, he was shot in a forest alongside, I think, his chauffeur. He could have been the czar when Nicholas abdicated, but he didn't want to be czar either, and so the monarchy was dissolved. Whoops, what's going on here? There we are. So yeah, he could have been the czar of Russia, and he wasn't. And it's funny, he's born just like 2 weeks before Stalin, who, like the Grand Duke Michael, is also a blue 2, but Stalin is a setting A rather than a rising C because he's born after the exterior conjunction. This is Paul Reynaud. He was a prime minister of France, and he resigned from his position rather than sign the German armistice in 1940 when the Nazis invaded France. And speaking of Nazis, this was the military commander-in-chief, the Reich Minister of War, Werner von Blomberg. And the only reason he wasn't executed at Nuremberg, he resigned in 1938 because his wife had pornographic pictures that were sort of leaked around the community, the Nazi community. And so he was sort of disgraced and he resigned. And for that reason, because he resigned in 1938, even though he had been the Minister of War, he wasn't Minister of War when, the invasion of Poland happened or anything that followed. So he wasn't held responsible for these things. But so he's kind of lucky. He was saved by the fact that his wife had some nudies taken. This is Peter Wrangel. He was one of the commanders of the anti-Bolshevik white forces. The Russian whites were the anti-Bolshevik generally the whites were usually pro-monarchy, although I think they also had factions that weren't necessarily pro-monarchy. Anyway, his army was defeated by the Bolsheviks, and he evacuated his army and died somewhere, either Istanbul or Paris. Those were two frequent destinations for the Russian exiles. But yeah, like after the Russian Revolution, people were scattered all over the place. Oh, and speaking of Bolsheviks, this is Yakov Yurovsky. He was the Bolshevik chief executioner of the Romanov family. He was in charge of having Tsar Nicholas and his family shot in the basement in Ekaterinburg in 1918, which occurred during a white 3 rising C interval, just like he was born under. So he was born during a rising C, and he had the royal family executed during a rising C. Revolutionaries, again, some of these people are people we've seen when I've looked at the white 3s, but we're looking at the rising Cs. So we look at some of them, but we look at how they integrate in this larger group of rising Cs. Pancho Villa, famous Mexican bandito chieftain revolutionary, who was eventually assassinated after the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920. He was assassinated in 1923. Someone else we've talked about before, Gustav Stresemann. He was the chancellor of the German Weimar Republic. He negotiated the Treaty of Locarno, and he was seen to be one of the only real hope for Weimar Germany, the only sort of strong leader they had in that era. But alas, he died, before he could sort of really put things right. And this is the first Shah of Iran. So he's the father of the Shah that we know of. The Shah who was his son was a red 3, and this Shah was a red 4. So this is the guy who sort of instigated the Pahlavi dynasty after the fall of the previous regime after the First World War, and then he had to abdicate when the British and Soviets invaded Iran in 1941 because they feared he would sell oil to the Nazis, or I think he was selling oil to the Nazis. I don't have a picture for this guy, Janos Forgas. He's a Hungarian minister to Serbia. He's important in the First World War, but I don't have a photo. I can't get one. This is another one of these White Russian military leaders. This is Lavr Kornilov. And yeah, he's a Siberian Cossack, and he was one of the people fighting against the Bolsheviks, but he was arrested. Actually, no, he was supposed to fight the Bolsheviks, but he was suspected in a plot against the provisional government, and he was arrested. And then I think he was later killed by the Bolsheviks. And this is another Russian imperial politician, and he was one of the people who participated in Rasputin's murder in 1916. This is one of the Krupp family. He was a German arms manufacturer, and he was on trial at Nuremberg, but the charges were dropped. It was deemed that he wasn't involved enough in the Holocaust to deem execution. This is R.B. Bennett. He was a Prime Minister of Canada during the 1930s, but he died in Great Britain. This is Queen Sophie of the Hellenes. She was the wife of the King of Greece, but she was also the younger sister of Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. So this is one of the reasons. She's also the mother of 2 future kings of Greece. So yeah, this is one of the reasons that Greece was neutral during the First World War, is that the queen was the younger sister of Kaiser Wilhelm, so that made it kind of awkward. But meanwhile, her husband was related to the Russian and British royal family. So that's how like all these royals are all sort of intermingled. This is another Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Benjamin Cardozo, who I think was appointed by Herbert Hoover and then died in 1938. So he was in the court during the Hoover and early Roosevelt years. I think his death helped sort of clear the air with the whole court packing thing, because once he died and then some other justices retired, then it wasn't necessary anymore to pack the court, and Roosevelt got what he wanted. More South Africans, but this is during the apartheid era. Well, actually, really, kind of. But Jan Smuts was more progressive. I mean, I would say he was still a white supremacist, but really, it was when the Nationalist Party of South Africa defeated Smuts's party in 1948 that apartheid was really instigated. Smuts, it's a very interesting story. He's really instrumental in helping, fight the Nazis. He's an important military leader in both world wars and ally to Winston Churchill. But at the same, and he's really instrumental in helping set up the United Nations. And then ironically, once the United Nations are founded, one of the first things that happened is South Africa is lambasted for its treatment of Africans. And as in a reaction to that, the South African Afrikaner nationalists, in sort of retaliation for being rebuked at the United Nations, which Smuts helped set up, that they get voted into office and they instigate official apartheid policy. So it's it's right in the middle of all that. So he's a very interesting figure, Smuts. Yet another U.S. Attorney General. This is Homer Style Cummings. He was U.S. Attorney General under Roosevelt. And we're seeing a lot of attorney generals who are rising seas. Very interesting. And yeah, I mentioned earlier, Lenin is a rising sea. So we've seen a lot of these Russian Red 4 rising seas, everyone from Gagarin to Kirov, Teroshenko, these really sort of uh, interesting and important Russian or Soviet figures. Um, this is James Cox. He ran for president at one point. I forget against who. Not Roosevelt. I forget who. Not Roosevelt, not Hoover, not Coolidge, maybe Harding. He might have run against Harding. I just can't remember. Anyway, he was also at a couple of points he was governor of Ohio. I think it had to be Harding. I'm running through my head all the different elections. It had to be Harding. Yeah, Baroness Marie Vetsera. She was the mistress of the Austrian-Hungarian Crown Prince Rudolph, and they died in a suicide pact. That's a whole interesting story. Entire books are written about it, but I'll leave it at that. She was shot by her husband, her lover, and then he killed himself. And this is another Russian politician who was active during the First World War. He also was involved in government both before the war and after the overthrow of the monarchy. He was a minister of war and ultimately unsuccessful, like the rest of them. And here's a prime minister of Imperial Russia, another opponent of Rasputin, someone else who couldn't hold on to power. And this is sort of in partner to Jan Smuts. This is Louis Botha, yet another, the very first prime minister of South Africa. So Smuts was the second prime minister of South Africa, and then we saw much later, the first two and the fourth presidents of the new South Africa are also rising seas, white 3. So there's a lot of white 3 rising seas in South African government, both before, in the era of white supremacist rule, and then in the post apartheid regime. This is Louis Barthou. He was prime minister of France, and he was assassinated alongside the king of Yugoslavia in, I think it was Marseille in 1934. It's the first assassination ever caught on film. It was someone who wanted to kill the king of Yugoslavia, and he just happened to be sitting next to the king, and, sucks to be you, dude. Right, this is Claude Debussy, a great composer. So earlier I was showing you all these great white 3 rising white 3 rising sea musicians like Miles Davis, Michael Jackson, Stevie Wonder, Paul McCartney, Prince, and Debussy is also in that group. And then another one of these Russian military guys. I know there's a lot of them showing up in this rising sea thread. This is Yudenich, yet another one of these military leaders and white Russian generals who fight the Bolsheviks and lose. This is Walter Fischer. He was Secretary of the Interior. I forget for whose government, so I'll just go through them. This is Enrico Caviglia. He was a marshal of the Italian army. He's a World War I hero for the Italians, and he was opposed to Mussolini. Edward Grey, he was a British foreign secretary, really, really important in British foreign policy going into the First World War. Basically, the guy responsible for Britain entering the First World War, or very, very instrumental in that. And this is a very important, yet another important Russian Red 4 rising sea figure. This is Peter Stolypin. He was the third prime minister of Russia, but he was seen to be very sort of strict and severe. He came down hard on the radicals after the 1905 revolution. He certainly had a hand in enabling the pogroms that were happening during this part of Russian history. And he was eventually assassinated by a bomb that, was it a bomb? He was killed in the opera house in Kiev, and Tsar Nicholas was there with his 2 daughters. was either a bomb or a gun, but they were right there in the opera house when he was killed. This is Charles Evans Hughes. He's got an interesting history. So he did run for president against Woodrow Wilson, but he was also twice on the U.S. Supreme Court. Once as the Chief Justice, and he also had at one point been governor of New York. So yeah, he did it all. Secretary. Oh, and he had been Secretary of State. He'd been governor of New York. He'd been both an associate. He'd twice nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court. So yeah, quite a dude. This is Aristide Briand. He was a prime minister of France, and he helped negotiate the Locarno Treaty with Stresemann. I showed you. So both guys who arranged the Locarno Treaty, which was a peace between, the Germany and France and I think Turkey. I'm getting all those treaties confused for each other. For some reason, I'm thinking Locarno has to do with the Ottoman Empire. But anyway, we saw Stresemann, Briand. I'll have to look that up. I get really confused. I should have all this stuff straight. It's amazing. That's the one thing. I go through these files and I realize like I've learned things and then I forget them. I'm hazy on this detail. I'm hazy on the other. That's why it's just kind of worth it, along other reasons, to go through these and remind myself of the things I've gone fuzzy on. So I need to review my material. Anyway, he's an important French diplomat and prime minister from this era. And yet another associate justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. This is George Sutherland, who's a Red 4 Rising C. He's another, alongside a minute ago, I was showing you Charles Evans Hughes, and George Sutherland was one of the justices they called the four horsemen of the apocalypse. They were totally against the New Deal. And most of them really were Red 4s. It's funny, like Roosevelt was the only Blue 4 president in U.S. history, and all his opponents, or many of his opponents on the U.S. Supreme Court, were Red 4s. Charles Evans Hughes was usually the fifth deciding vote alongside the four horsemen, and George Sutherland here is one of those so-called four horsemen Supreme Court justices. This is George Buchanan. He was the British ambassador to Russia at the outbreak of the First World War, and so he's sort of an important figure in the diplomatic front as war is breaking out in the sort of the agreements between Britain and Russia, because of course Britain and Russia enter the war as allies. Pope, I've looked at I've entered all the popes into my slideshow going back, a good 300 years or so, until we start finding popes whose birthdays we don't know. So this is Pope Benedict XV, and he spoke out for peace during the First World War. He was Pope during the First World War. Poets, I showed you Allen Ginsberg earlier. This is another Rising C poet, Arthur Rimbaud. Who I find him interesting because of this other writer and poet who was born just before him. Whoops, he's not there. Okay, interesting. I don't have Oscar Wilde here. Oscar Wilde was born just before Arthur Rimbaud, and I find them interesting to study as a pair. I thought I had Oscar Wilde in the slideshow, but I guess I don't. But I must add him because he makes a great sort of comparison study, a time twin study alongside Arthur Rimbaud, both of whom were involved in scandals involving homosexual affairs between older and younger partners. Whereas Oscar Wilde would go to prison for having a homosexual affair with a younger man. Rimbaud was, basically a young teenager, and he was, what's the name of the poet? Paul. God, see, this is where I forget these really obvious names I've known forever, names of people whose biographies I've read. Senior moments. There you go. It's my 55th birthday. Anyway, he was also involved in a trial because he was a much younger partner, and this is in the 1870s, of course, when everyone's crazy homophobic. All right, moving right along. Aehrenthal is the foreign minister of Austria-Hungary. and he's kind of a pivotal figure in 1908 for these negotiations he has with his Russian counterpart over the Bosnian crisis in 1908. If you know some Bosnian history or some, pre-World War I European history, he's an important sort of pivotal figure for this one very famous conversation he has. This is another Canadian Prime Minister. This is Robert Borden. He was the 8th Prime Minister of Canada, and he was Prime Minister of Canada during the First World War. Paul Rennenkampf, he's an army general for the Russian Empire, and he led the Russian army during the First World War, and he was later executed by the Bolsheviks because Bolsheviks. Yet another Russian military commander. This is the guy who persuaded the Tsar to abdicate in 1917. This is a U.S. Vice President, Thomas Marshall. He was Vice President under Woodrow Wilson. And famously, when Woodrow Wilson had his stroke, Marshall should have taken over as president, but he wasn't aware. He was kept unaware of Wilson's condition. And so he didn't sort of assert himself and take his place as the rightful sort of acting president of the U.S. at the time. This is another American cabinet guy. This is Luke Edward Wright, who was the 43rd U.S. Secretary of War. At one point, he was also Governor General of the Philippines and ambassador to Japan. Rose Cleveland, this is another one of these acting first ladies that I've shown you. In this case, she was the sister of Grover Cleveland, and she served as First Lady. Before Cleveland got married, which he did in the White House. All right, my voice is wearing out, and it's my birthday, so I think I'm out of words here. Okay. Well, people have been watching, so I guess you've been enjoying that. So Chelsea, to answer your question, when you ask me to explain the qualities, I'm still working toward being able to articulate them. I have some kind of sense of it, but I'm looking at more and more and more, and I'm going to just like make more slides and look at more charts and let this all sort of come at its own pace. But thank you everyone for sort of sitting through that. I hope you enjoy it. I think some of you do, just like having me go through the slideshow. That's very often what these solo streams involve. This is kind of like a work diary that I'm using to help me sort out this material so I can articulate it properly and really get a sense of how to present it and ultimately answer your question, Chelsea, even if I haven't necessarily been able to do it today. All right, I'm off to enjoy my birthday. I hope you all enjoy your week. Thank you for tuning in. And join Patrick and I next Sunday. And Sam will be back, I believe, next Monday. As you know, when Sam and I do a stream together, we start an hour earlier than my normal stream time to accommodate his schedule because he's a busy man. But I look forward. Sam's got a really interesting slideshow to show us next week. So I'm really looking forward to that. For those of you, I hope you enjoyed the 3 streams that Sam and I did together over the past month or whatever it's been. Yeah, it's been the past month. I think the first time was July 17th. So yeah, Sam and I have done 3 streams together, and that was enough ultimately for me to get through my humongous slideshow and sort of work my way through that. But yeah, Sam's got a really, really interesting slideshow to show and discuss with you all. So I hope you'll turn in next Monday, 1 hour earlier than the usual stream. That's 10 o'clock in the morning Pacific time and 1 o'clock Eastern. All right. I'm off to enjoy my first day as a 55-year-old, and I hope you all have a terrific week. Thank you all, and see you soon.